always helps to turn the microphone on. This is why Maria's the pro, and I'm stuck in text. So thanks everybody for coming out today to talk about journalism and some other issues as we go forward. First, I want to thank the Texas Book Festival and the El Paso Community Foundation for making this event possible. And it's a real thrill to be here with a journalism legend, Maria Hinojosa. Maria and I were talking a little bit backstage about some previous interactions we've had, and I'm going to use that to frame some of our conversations. But it's really great to have her out here. Maria has reported from El Paso a number of times. I think she's almost a resident of Texas now because she's back here so often, and she could talk a little bit about what's drawing her back to Texas. But as you can imagine, with the focus of her journalism, Texas is in many ways the center of a lot of these important conversations that Maria helps drive. So Maria, thank you so much for joining us. And I think it's important, and I definitely want to urge people to read your book. So I don't want to give away the whole book through this conversation, but I think it's important to talk about your origin story too, because that really, I think, shapes your journalism and your life. So tell the audience a little bit about where you come from and kind of what's led you on your path.
What's up, El Paso? And hey, Bob, great to be back with you. And whoever thought of the dark chocolate, thank you. My origin story actually has something to do with El Paso, and that's why whenever I come back here, I always am thinking about all of these multiple connections. But basically, mi papá, el Dr. Raúl Hinojosa, my son is Raúl Ariel. Dr. Raúl Hinojosa, may he rest in peace, is hired by the University of Chicago to be part of the team that ultimately creates the cochlear implant. My dad was a nerdy Mexicano from Tampico, a medical doctor. And, my mom flies from Mexico City to Chicago with the 4 kids to meet my dad, who had been in Chicago for a bit now, maybe 6 months. And when we fly from Mexico City, we have to change planes in Dallas and then catch another plane to Chicago. This is 1962. And it's in the Dallas airport that it turns out that I'm almost taken by immigration agents. And the story of why that happens, it's all very kind of, when you're growing up and you're trying to understand, but ultimately to make a long story short, which that's why you can read the book, because it's a little bit longer, there is a law that existed on the Texas books that originated here in El Paso. You know this. I'm not going to tell you your history because you all know this. The law basically said, the law existed up until 1964, but up until then, you had to actually check Mexican immigrants' workers' bodies. Sound familiar? We were considered disease-prone, therefore a threat. Sound familiar? So the remnants of that were that at the airport, the immigration agent saw that I had a rash. And that's when he said, we're just going to keep the little baby girl. You, ma'am, and your 3 other kids can just go on to Chicago. Which is just like, where were they going to put me? Which is actually like, when I think about like an investigative story that I should really, because obviously I wasn't the only one. There was going to be a place where he was going to take me. So how many other babies and children had been taken to that space? Who knows? Anyway, so that was my arrival story. And then I grew up in Chicago at a time when there were not many Mexicans in Chicago, and feeling a little bit invisible, which leads me to, extraordinary privilege. I went to a private high school in Chicago, end up in the Ivy League at Barnard, and that leads me to being the first Latina hired at NPR in editorial in 1985.
What led you to journalism? In reading your book, you had a lot of talents. You could have gone any number of different directions, but what led you to journalism?
Well, the truth is, for those of you who saw the movie In the Heights, I always wanted to be an actress. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just watch the protest scene in the movie In the Heights. But yeah, no, that dream was the bubble was popped pretty early on in New York. And so I started doing college radio at Columbia University, which has a huge radius, a huge listenership. And back then, radio was our Twitter, our Instagram, it was everything. And so even though I did a radio show that was very journalistic in nature, a lot of interviews, there was a lot of political activity among Latinos and Latinas in New York at the time, in the 1980s, Central America. So I was doing a lot of cultural reporting, political reporting, and then to be honest with you, you'll see this. I mean, I just didn't think that I was good enough to be a journalist in the United States. I had no reference point. There were still relatively few women in journalism in general. And I didn't have an image that I could do that. So thank God there was a great career services advisor at Barnard who saw in me what I couldn't see. And she was like, "You're applying for that NPR internship." And that's ultimately what led me to make the decision, because I got the internship, got to NPR, and I was like, wow, yeah, I love this. And that's where it all started. And then, I'm sorry, the philosophical understanding was that I understood that I had the privilege to understand a whole sector of society, and that I had the responsibility to therefore report about it, bring it into the newsrooms, into the editorial meetings, and talk about it, which is what I do today.
I want to talk about an El Paso story, which is, among other things, it's where you and I first intersected in around 2016. I was at the El Paso Times as the editor. We had done what was a local story that you had picked up on, and then you took it and ran with it. And I'll talk in a minute about why I think this is kind of an important example. But to talk about Estrella's story and how you've continued 7 years on to continue to pursue this story.
So first of all, I want to give thanks to Bob and to the reporters at the El Paso Times and to all local journalists. And when you're like thinking, well, nobody cares, we do, and we're listening and we're waiting and watching for these stories. So it was because of local journalists that the Estrella story gets national attention, and then we were able to basically get this exclusive to tell her story. So days after Donald Trump is inaugurated, Estrella is the first person that we know of that was taken by ICE and Border Patrol from a courtroom at a courthouse, which is considered untouchable, like a hospital, like a school, like a church. But of course, we now know that there are no boundaries for immigration and Border Patrol agents, and we can talk about that. Some people get very upset with me when I say it's like a Gestapo. And we can talk about that. So anyway, she's taken, and it's not just that she's taken, but it's that Border Patrol and ICE lie. As Bob said, no surprise. But there was a little bit of a surprise on a national level, like, wait, what, they lie? And then, I know, and then we were able to get to her lawyer, who I'm so thankful for, who's based here in El Paso, and we start telling her story in 2017. And Estrella is an undocumented immigrant. She is a trans woman serving a 9-year sentence in a maximum security men's prison on the border of Oklahoma for the nonviolent crime of fraud. That's what she's serving 9 years for. She was trafficked and forced to get bad checks and basically commit fraud. it's another way in which people who are trafficked are forced to do things against
By the
them.
way, I think it's important to note here, too, that the reason she was in court that day was not to answer to the criminal charges. She was there to get a restraining order against her partner. Her partner notified ICE that she would be there, and that's how she wound up in their custody.
Great journalist. Just put this. Thank you. So yeah, so she was there because she was a victim. And then they take her, and I think their analysis, Bob, I don't know, it was just like, she's a trans woman, undocumented, formerly deported with a record. Who's going to care about her? In fact, that's exactly the kinds of people that I care about and want to report about. And so we have been in touch. Then the Texas Department of Corrections banned me from being in touch with her for about 2 years. I could only receive phone calls, but no letters, no visits. And then it's going to be a year ago, this past December, they gave me permission to go visit Estrella. And so now I go visit Estrella. She's in Wichita Falls, which is on the border of Oklahoma. And, you know, her story is a deep investigative piece into how law enforcement and immigration treats a victim and makes her to be a criminal when she's the victim that we should be protecting. So there's a great investigative angle in the fact that we've been reporting about her since 2017. But Estrella, to me, is just one of the most fascinating human beings who I've met. And if you listen to Suave, which won the Pulitzer last year, you know, you think when you talk with people in prison that it's always like, no, I hate prison, prison. It's not. I mean, there are those moments. Estrella was raped in prison, so we've had that. But a lot of the times it's Estrella telling me, uy, pues voy a cocinar unos tamales y voy a hacer una pizza and I'm going to do, and you know, and it's like, wait, what? How are you cooking? And she explains to me how she's cooking, or the exercises that she's doing, or the makeup that she puts on, or the fact that she threads herself, and the fact that she's fought for the hormones. And every time I go visit her, she's more and more beautiful. She's more and more the woman who she always wanted to be. She's in a men's prison, which is incredibly dangerous. And I'll just end with this. So usually, Bob and I know, when you go to a prison, you dress down, usually. But I am a reflection of the woman that Estrella is going to be when she gets out. And a lot of our talk is about what's going to happen when she gets out. And so when I go to visit her in Wichita Falls, I get decked out. I wear stilettos. The last time I wore these like flowy, culotte, silky pants with you have to cover your shoulders, so you always have to have something. And the next time I'm wearing these boots, because I just got them. And when I walk, I strut the entire way because they all watch as we're coming. You know, there's a long way that they're watching. And I didn't know this until the most recent visit that they watch. And so now I strut because I want all of those men to know that this journalist from New York is coming with a camera and a crew to spend an hour, just 1 hour, to speak to Estrella, the most fascinating person that I know. And that she needs to be treated with respect.
So for me, there's a couple of takeaways from that story that I think help frame the broader conversation I wanted to have today. One is, first of all, you've stuck with this story for more than 6 years now, which is not at all usual. You also, there was other national media coverage sort of rehashing the El Paso Times coverage after the story first broke, and then the story was over, right? And you know, oh, so sad that ICE took this woman out of a courthouse, lied about it. By the way, we know they lied about it because they said in court filings under oath that they intercepted her outside the courthouse, and we were able to get video that showed the ICE officers walking into the courtroom, walking her out, taking her on the elevator down, and then out. Because there's cameras everywhere now. So there was like this initial outrage, and with so much of immigration and border coverage from that era, it was sort of one moment of outrage, and then we're moving on to the next thing, the next moment of outrage. You've stuck with it. The reason I think that's true, and I want to test this hypothesis with you, is in part because of who you are and your own personal background. When you and I both started in journalism roughly the same time in mid-1980s, we walked into newsrooms where there were a whole lot of people who looked like me and not a whole lot of people who looked like you. And so you were a trailblazer. So talk about that and the role of being a Latina, being an immigrant, and how that shapes your approach to journalism.
So it's interesting because, like, in the context of staying in touch with people, the role of being a Latina, being an immigrant, being a Mexican woman has actually, I'm like, nothing. I think it's that as a human and as a journalist in my core, there is something about seeing, like, there's a story here, there is an injustice here, but there's a human being here. And so it's like that capacity to connect on a very human level, which I learned in some ways from great television journalists who did not look like me. People like Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes, or even Dan Rather, or Harry Reasoner, or all of those dudes, right? And you're like, who are they? The older people know who I'm talking about.
Google it, yeah.
Google, haz el Google. There was something about the rawness of their reporting, much of it happening during the Civil Rights era, the Vietnam War. So the notion of, again, Estrella's story, like there's an extraordinary story about that's a journalistic piece, which is, oh my God, they lied. Also, they took her from a courtroom, like they're not supposed to. Also, she's a victim. So yes, but then you get beyond that, and it's just Estrella's story in and of itself is an incredible story of human survival. And I mean, that might be the bigger question. Why am I so fascinated with people who who are surviving in these very challenging moments? And I think because, oh my God, it's a source of inspiration for all of us, right? I mean, it takes a lot to put us down as human beings, a lot. And I'm inspired by that, I meet a lot of stars. I'm meeting one of the stars of Orange is the New Black on Tuesday. I'm going to be honored in this great thing. I have nothing to wear. I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to, it's like 11 in the morning. How am I going to get hair and makeup done? Like, I'm totally freaking out because I'm not thinking about that right now. I'm thinking about the reporting I'm doing in Texas. But meeting stars is not, it's fine. It's fine because you realize that they're just human. But it's when you meet people who never expected to be asked how they feel about things. So I guess when you ask the question, how does that come from my perspective of being a Mexican immigrant? It's because I was the other, always understood being the other. I was the outsider. I was not an American citizen. I became one when I was almost 30. So I understood like the role and responsibility of American journalists in this country. So that part of me understands invisibility and deep responsibility. Like I understand my privilege, how lucky I was. So then it really leads me to a sense of responsibility. And if you move in the world of journalism as you do, Bob, which is why Bob is known all over the country as a great representative of your city, as like a great journalist who speaks the truth, it's because you are diligent in this profession and because you keep on doing it and because you're not afraid to speak the truth, which is also humanity. There's like this, like, as when Bob and I started, which was, there's two sides to every story. And I mean, if you ever saw the Saturday Night Live spoof about public television, it was like, and tonight, The pros and cons of cannibalism. No. There are not two sides to putting a child in a cage. Sorry. And so if we have gotten to that point in our country, something is wrong. And you know what? We know it's wrong because of everything that we're living through on a daily basis that manifested January 6th, right? And that is the result of, and that does go to my experience, because since 2015, when Donald Trump was out there, I was like, hey, this guy can win. And they were like, oh God, Maria, tú y tus locuras. Tan loca ella. And I was like, no, he can, because I travel the country. And our colleagues who look like Bob, right, but who do not have the conscience or solidarity of Bob, then repeated hateful things said by a candidate when it was hate speech, and they knew, and it was lies, it was factually, data-wise lies. And they continued to say, well, there's two sides to every story. Well, look where we are now. Our democracy is incredibly fragile, and you know that. You've suffered the consequences right here of that, more than most.
That actually anticipated the next question that I wanted to ask, because you're really good at this stuff. So many journalists are brought up with this idea of objectivity being the holy grail, and journalists often live in mortal fear of being labeled an advocate or an activist. Your journalism has a point of view, right? And you don't run from that. How do you address those out there who support the both sidesism and this what I think is a false standard of objectivity?
So my colleague Maria Garcia is here someplace, I think. ¿Dónde estás? Aquí. I mean, the problem is like I'm traveling so much, like I'm so crazy, and I'm very compartmentalized that I'm like, okay, this is where I am, and then I'm going to the next place, and then, you know, last night I'm flying to El Paso, and Maria's like, wait, aren't you coming to El Paso? And I'm like, yeah, and she's like, I live here, and I'm like, oh, that's right. So I'm going to have dinner with my colleague, which I'm really looking forward to. And thank you, Maria, for joining Futuro Media, for remaining in El Paso, keeping it real, and for everything that you have done for telling the story of Selena y más. She's not done yet, let me tell you. It's not over. It's so not over. Not over.
If you have not listened to the Everything for Selena podcast, what is wrong with you?
What's wrong with you?
but do it. It's a great podcast.
Do it. So Maria talks about radical transparency, right? And I think that's something that we do want to practice in our journalism. I think that, you know, when you say we have a point of view, I'm like, well, but do we? I don't know, because I feel like we're just really honest about the stories that we're telling. And the fact that we have a show called Latino USA that this year turns 30 years old. I know, I started doing it when I was 10. It's incredible. Incredible. You know, we do a show about Latinos and Latinas, but it is not just celebration, right? It is critical reporting about Latinos and Latinas. That's only going to increase because Latinos and Latinas are kind of going a little crazy in the United States of America. You know, when you've got about a quarter of the population voting for somebody that is basically speaking hate speech about them, we have something that we need to address. So I don't know if reporting about Latinos and Latinos is a point of view. It's a community. It's an American story. So I think our point of view is to go in deep, to not be afraid to go in deep, to pull back the layers, to tell stories with incredible heart, and to give space in our journalism, I think increasingly an element of levity also, which is so important. If you talk to people who have lived through authoritarian regimes or dictatorships, the movie It's a Beautiful Life, the importance of levity. Like in one of our hit podcasts, The Last Cup, the anchor Jasmine Guards. And by the way, if you haven't listened to that also, but one of the things that I remember is the fact that she already had a name for her punk rock band when she was in Buenos Aires, living as a little teenager. I'm like, she had a punk rock band already in Buenos Aires as a vision of what it's a little tiny detail, but something that I will remember forever from that podcast because it's an element of humanity. Those things don't happen just by chance. They happen with a lot of work under the direction of someone like Maria Garcia that makes sure that those details, like the one she brought up in her podcast, that remain with us. We talk about this a lot in the newsroom, but also it's not prescribed. And I think one of the things that we try to do a lot is also support the journalists who work with us because they're good, right? And so then when you're supporting them, they want to do even better work. And I think that's what also leads to success. Like having happy journalists in your newsroom really is a good thing. Having very unhappy, angry, upset journalists who are worried that they're going to lose their jobs at any moment is not a good thing for us. It does not give journalists then the capacity to come in and fight for a story when they know that people are being laid off. And there are layoffs that just happened at NPR the last 3 days. It's been very, very, very tough. We're losing Silvia Poggioli. She was not laid off. I think in an act of solidarity, she said, in order to prevent more layoffs, I'm going to step down. Interestingly, I know Sylvia. I haven't talked to her in a very long time. But, for those of you who are NPR fanatics, and by the way, Latino USA is now distributed by PRX, so we left NPR. But NPR, they receive the hate letters, right? And the hate letters go like this. Oh, we love the way Silvia Poggioli says her name in Italy, in Rome. But why does Maria Hinojosa have to say her name that way? Make her stop it. That's the public radio audience.
I want to go back to talk about your book for a minute. And again, I don't want to steal your thunder from the book because people really should read it. I was struck, you talked about honesty in your journalism and the way you approach things. Your book is very honest about your own experiences. You're a survivor of sexual violence. You talk very candidly about mental health issues you've dealt with. How difficult was that to relive as you were writing your memoir, and why did you feel it was important to include that?
So when you're writing a memoir as a journalist, it's like you have to be really honest. I mean, you're going to write like a dishonest memoir, So I'm a very cathartic writer. I have a brilliant editor. Her name is Michelle Herrera Mulligan. She's Irish Mexican from Chicago, of course. And the whole notion of my imposter syndrome or the insecurities and, talking to my therapist about this. And this was something that was just happening throughout my life. Like as I was writing about, the first time I was going to that fancy private school and actually we didn't have a name for it. But I was having panic attacks for 3 weeks straight. I was just throwing up every morning, and, uncontrollably, and of course not saying anything to anyone because, I'm supposed to be just grateful, which I was. And thank God I was able to just get to a point where I was like, okay, this needs to stop. But that's what it was. So those were just very truthful stories that were part of my life. And my editor was able to... Oh, because I wrote an extra 100,000 words. I delivered the manuscript, and she's like, oh my God, it's so good. You just wrote an extra 100,000 words. And I was like, what? And she was like, don't worry, I'm going to do surgical removal. And so what she was able to do was find those threads and the mental health, imposter, insecurities. And people were like, why do you want to talk about that, Maria? And I'm like, because I don't want anybody to have to go through with it. It's a waste of time. We have to, I understand it. I went through it. I'm not dismissing mental health, but we've got to if possible, one, find therapy, do the work, but also we have work to do. We are needed in the field, on the front lines. The writing about the rape was a challenge, but it is part of my story as a Mexican immigrant girl. The rape happens in Mexico. There are other dramatic and traumatic things that happened to me in Mexico, and of course also in the United States. But I was like, it's part of the trying to figure out de dónde soy, de qué lado, and I also wanted to be honest about it. I had been doing pretty intensive therapy to come to terms with the fact that I was raped. I didn't used to think that was what had happened to me, but it's very clear, of course, that's what happened. So I don't want to be una mujer con pena, with shame. I'm not a woman who has shame. So writing about the rape, writing about anything that might be considered a little bit more private and intimate. And there were things that got cut, let me tell you. I was like, oh my God, at least my editor knows the truth about that. But 50,000 people aren't going to. And I just think that the honest, again, radical transparency for me really works, because it's the way in which I approach my profession and the way I approach my writing. But writing about the rape was definitely the most challenging part of the entire book, was just that moment. It was like, that and the introduction were the more difficult parts of the book to write.
We asked people as they were coming in to feel free to submit questions, and one of the questions that came in was, of all the stories you've reported on, which is the most difficult from an emotional standpoint to be able to do. I don't know if there's an easy choice for you in there, because you cover a lot of emotional stories, a lot of them in Texas, as it turns out. You were here after the El Paso shooting. You've been reporting consistently about Uvalde since that happened. You write very extensively in your book about going into detention facilities. You were the first journalist to really be able to show what was happening in ICE detention facilities. And again, read the book, because the descriptions are very horrific. So talk a little bit about the emotional impact of being a journalist and trying to tell those stories honestly, while also trying to process your own emotions too.
So the answer as to which is the story that just completely floored me, it's absolutely September 11th, because I was a young mother in New York. And it was a story that then I reported for a full year, every single day, because it was a city where I lived. And I developed PTSD, like for reals. And that just really stays with you. Ay, Dios mío, Bob. La verdad es de que I don't know. This is my job. This is like what I signed up for recently. I'm not going to cry.
I'm glad I'm not the only one who does this. So I'm just trying to validate this for my wife too, I think, at part two.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
She sees me do this all the time.
Yeah, it's true. So when I was doing therapy recently, I was like, well, I can't really complain about this. I mean, this is what I wanted. It's what I asked for, to have an investigative unit, right? So when you do investigative work that has this kind of human element, yeah, it cuts deep. So, like if I was to tell you the things that I've seen just in the past 5 months, right? It's like, poof, no, you don't want to hear it. And I'm like, I haven't. I remember doing therapy in the Miami parking lot, Miami airport parking lot, just doing therapy before I got on a plane to Rome to be with my family and disconnect. And just like the therapy about the reporting that we're doing about ICE detention, the same goddamn story from 2011, the same story, of ICE and the agents just sexually assaulting woman after woman, the doctors and the nurses. And I'm like, look, I'm thinking about that story, and I'm getting traumatized from what we interviewed, the interviews and doing therapy in the airport. And I'm just like, sí, mija, Pero eso fue en noviembre. And from November until now, it's like the things that I'm seeing. So this is my job. It is my job to report on this. I have the privilege of having my own newsroom. I have the privilege of running my own investigative unit. You know that movie, I'm the Captain Now? I'm 60 Minutes now. That's right. So, thank you. So it is deep responsibility, and each one of those human connections that I have, they stay with me. So it's my responsibility to learn how to not carry that. It's my responsibility to, continue to do the therapy, which I'm back to doing, and to listen to my therapist. She's like, you got to ground yourself, right? You got to put your feet on the ground. It's hard when you're wearing 6-inch platform. But I try, and to have the rootedness and yet the capacity to understand that there is brilliance and light that is coming from here and receiving the light also. And that I am capable of doing this work. Not everybody can. So, yeah, I have to disconnect. Last week, I was very far away. Those of you who follow me know, I was in the Dominican Republic, and I completely disconnected and did not feel guilt. Well, the first 2 days, and then my husband was like, you really are on vacation. You really do not need to do anything. And I was like, okay. And then some of you may not be cool with this, but I'm also radically transparent and very honest. After 9/11 was when I started consuming cannabis, and it was the thing that I was most ashamed of. I never wanted to take pills. That's just not my preference. And it was something that I was so ashamed about until during the pandemic, we have a home, a cottage, it's this big, in Connecticut. And after the pandemic, it was like, we really should be in the cottage. But we didn't even have a car because we're New Yorkers. I know. So I'm a medical marijuana patient in the state of Connecticut, and you can't touch me. You can't touch me. You can't shame me. You can't make me feel bad. And mi plantita, blessed is how I say. So that's one way, and I don't drink, which is an issue for us, right? So I'm just saying, it's not just that. It's the fact that I meditate. Those of you who follow me know, today was an important day. It was 1,270th day straight of meditation. I box. I work out. I'm engaged. I'm a birder. I'm a succulentologist. Not a Scientologist, a succulentologist. And I really try to find joy and laughter in everything that I do, even the deep investigative reporting, like thank you for bringing up our hit podcast, USA versus Garcia Luna, where we just laugh a lot. So yeah, that's the way I do it. And I allow myself to have feelings like the ones that you just witnessed, so thank you.
You talk about the investigative unit that you run, and this also comes up in the book where you're sort of at a career transition and weren't sure where to go, and then your husband and some others are like, run your own show, right? And so that's the beginning of Futuro Media, which has grown so much since then, and doing such great work at all different levels. And as you just mentioned, not all like deadly serious and depressing. You have a lot of fun and everything. But as I was reading the book, I kept kind of thinking back to when you started and when I started in journalism. women were underrepresented in newsrooms. That has changed a lot. Most newsrooms now are largely female. If you go into a journalism classroom, mostly women. But there's still a gap in leadership that most news organizations are still run by men. So what advice would you have for women who want to be leaders in media and follow in your footsteps?
To just never give up. I mean, honestly, it's, people talk about microaggressions, and I'm like, ooh, micro? I mean, I'm a boxer now, and I understand the context of weaving and ducking, but that was basically the whole, years of my career. And I think we know that as women. It's, the sexual harassment is real. It's horrible. But we need them, right? As we need our young journalists who still believe in our profession, as we need our journalists who are Latino, Latina, Muslim, queer, trans, etc. We need them to be present and to be bringing their perspectives into our newsrooms so that we can do better reporting. It's not a career for the faint of heart, and you really do have to understand mission, right? So that Bob is able to say, okay, well, it's not working for me at the El Paso Times, but I'm not going to shut down and go sell real estate or whatever. I believe that there's a way in which I can carve out another form of being a journalist. And that's because of his commitment to mission. And not every journalist has it, but you do need it to stay in this business for sure. But we need you desperately.
Another great question from the audience, and especially considering some of the heavy subject matter that we just covered. How do you find ways to inspire people to fight for change when circumstances can feel very bleak?
Because, and I'm feeling like circumstances are pretty bleak right now, to be honest with you. Like there's, reporting on Garcia Luna and taking on the DEA. I don't know. Did you miss the part? I don't know did you hear this part about the story, which is that after we did our podcast, and if you're like, what is she talking about? Listen to the podcast, USA versus Garcia Luna, the second largest narco trial after El Chapo, by a dude who is working for the Mexican president, working for the DEA, and he was also working for El Chapo. So great U.S. intelligence. But I forgot the question, Bob.
Talking about staying engaged when things look really bleak.
Okay, so we are taking on these massive institutions, right? In this case, really pointing at corruption within the U.S. government, the DEA. And so Republican Senator Chuck Grassley wrote a letter to the director of the FBI and of the DEA and said basically, according to Maria Hinojosa and Perilei Ramirez's podcast, there's some serious problems with corruption here. We want everything that you have about Garcia Luna and we want it delivered now. Who would have thought that a Republican senator would be using our podcast to basically say to the DEA and the FBI that they got to fess up to what was happening. So, but also taking on the Border Patrol, which is the largest law enforcement institution in the United States on a federal level. And, it's a majority Latino, Latina institution. That makes you feel pretty bleak. So to me, the commitment is to understand that our role as journalists is to continue to remain engaged at that level. That if we start just there are times like last week when you're disconnected, when you don't want to know, when you're, not thinking about what's happening. We need that, right, to save our souls. But the rest of the time, we're literally doing the work of saving democracy. Like all of you who are out here, I'm like, it's Friday at whatever on Friday night in El Paso. Let's go get some burritos at Cristóstomos, no? Or let's go to Juarez and get some tacos. And yet you chose to be here. And those of you who know me also know that I call myself a democracy junkie. Because in the end, to me, yes, it's about my profession of journalism, but in the end, it's really about democracy. It's about making you feel like you have the agency to come here, the agency to go vote, the agency to protest, the agency to organize, the agency to have conversations with our fellow, in this case, Tejanos, right, about what's going on. And to me, by the way, when people are talking about bleak, and I'm like, to me, Texas is not bleak. I really believe that Texas is in play, and that anybody who says Texas should be written off is making a huge mistake. And you all are on the front lines of making that happen. So I continue to have to find ways to inspire myself, because I know that this is my responsibility. This is my part of the bargain. And I take that, it's like my civic duty, and I take it really seriously, especially because I chose to become an American citizen.
Following up on that, I know we have in our audience here some journalism students from the University of Texas at El Paso, and they, yes, applause.
That cannabis conversation is not to be had with your professors, whatever.
These students undoubtedly have heard some of the bleak stories about the state of media. They watched a president declare the media the enemy of the people. You just talked about the 10% layoffs at NPR. What's your message to them about pursuing a career in journalism, and hopefully why they should?
It's not easy, but nothing in life is easy. So this notion of like, well, I just want an easy, no. Obviously, if you're a journalism student, you're prepared to take on complexity. So it's affirming and doing everything that you can to affirm your understanding of the responsibility that you have, that it isn't just a job, it is a responsibility. One of the key books that really changed my life and understanding about my role as an American journalist is News for All the People, written by Juan Gonzalez and Joe Torres. Juan Gonzalez is the preeminent American journalist who you should know. And so it's a book where it's called News for All the People, the epic story of journalists of color in the United States. And the understanding is that those of us who are journalists of conscience, and you do not have to be a journalist of color to be a journalist of conscience, right? It's very important that you understand that. And that's why I'm so happy to be on stage with Bob, because journalists of conscience and of solidarity have a particular role to play, right? So for me, my guiding light, my North Star is actually Frederick Douglass, right? Who was born into slavery and then became a free man and became the first editor-in-chief of a black newspaper, the North Star. I mean, he faced all kinds of challenges, and yet he persisted, right? After the El Paso massacre, I mean, who would have thought that that would be the way that I would connect so deeply with Jovita Idar, who is from El Paso, a turn-of-the-century journalist, who had, her newspaper was almost shut because the Texas Rangers came to shut her down, and she was like tiny like me, and she kept them out the first time they came. So understanding that we, me, Bob, Jovita, Frederick Douglass, we are all part of that incredible arc of journalists of conscience and of responsibility in this country. And if you understand that, then you know that, so not every day is going to be a win, but that in the long haul, this is about our role in the democratic process. And to me, you need to understand that. And as you understand that, you also understand your privilege, right? Because if you're here, you have privilege. Doesn't mean that you're wealthy, doesn't mean that you have a perfect life, doesn't mean that you don't have all kinds of personal challenges. We all do. But you are privileged, and therefore you have a responsibility. And if you understand that sense of responsibility, it will guide you.
So my last question, and not to give away all of your stories or anything, but what's coming up from Maria Hinojosa that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Oh, so much. And I'd love to reveal what Maria Garcia is also working on, but we're really keeping it under wraps, and it's like we have to keep it so under wraps that we're now using code words. Yeah, it's like that. Actually, I'm making a joke about it, but some of the work that we're doing is so intense that we have to use code words in order to keep people safe. We're working on season 2 of Suave. That is public. So if you didn't listen to season 1 of Suave,
What is
what's
wrong
the
with
matter
you?
with you? You're super lucky because you get to binge on a really phenomenal podcast. So we're working on season 2. The story that we're doing is based in Texas, and Suave is no longer just a character. He's a producer in season 2, which is really fabulous and exciting. I'm going to say it on the understanding that you're not going to tweet about this, and I've done it a couple of times, and it's been good. And also, Bob knows where all of you live. And so does Maria Garcia. We will come after you. So it's not being live streamed, is it?
No.
No. So we are actually doing 2 documentaries about the shooting in Uvalde. We're doing another hour-long documentary for Latino USA. And we're doing one for Frontline, which is a very, very big deal. Yeah. So don't say anything about it because we're really as you know, if you follow me, I'm like, oh, here I am, I'm over here, I'm doing this. And my people were like, not on this story, we're going to hold it close to the chest until we're ready to talk about it. I just want you to know that in that case, it's a story of so much hope and love and possibility. Do not tweet this out, the piece, the digital piece that I'm going to write that will probably not be a part of either the Latino USA documentary nor the Frontline, and it's kind of tough the headline I'm about to give, but the story of Uvalde, and that's why there's not a lot that you can investigate here because it is the epic public failure of Texas manhood. I know, you're like, oh, what? What? Because the police know what an assault weapon can do. The police know that there are bullets that can only be used in assault weapons that cut through your vest. Your bulletproof vest, it's actually a kind of bulletproof vest. So this is a society that says it loves police, and yet it sells on the open market bullets that will shoot through police bulletproof vests. So that's some crazy, crazy things. But that's essentially, it's like, les dio miedo. They were scared. And meanwhile, and also the other horror is that the massacre, because of those weapons, massacre happened within the first 2 minutes, and then they got there already. So do not tweet that out. That's going to be part of what we reveal in our investigation. But Uvalde, for me, the story that has taken me, this tragedy that has taken me there, that has taken up, these 6 months, 7, 8 months of my life, it's a part of the country that I now feel completely indebted to, and I didn't know this deeply until I went deep into the story. And we are all indebted, right? That region of Texas, Uvalde and Crystal City, are actually one of the key birthplaces of the modern Chicano-Chicana movement and of the Brown Berets and of the Chicano-Chicana resistance of the 60s and 70s. Because, as you know, or maybe you don't, the site of Uvalde is one of the places where they had one of the longest student walkouts in American history in 1970 because they were paddling you if you spoke Spanish. And as I was telling that to the person who drove me to the hotel, she was like, oh yeah, they did that here too in El Paso. So in Uvalde, they said, hasta aquí no más. And they walked out. And that's why the massacre in Uvalde is so telling, because it is a place that is really battling and taking it. The divisions in Uvalde are still very real. It's not the story you hear about El Paso, for example. You don't hear like, oh my God, El Paso is such a divided city. Oh, what a divided city. No, Uvalde, yes, around the issue of race still. And that's not just South Texas history or Texas history, that's American history. And the fact that massacres in South Texas and Texas have been happening for over a century. And so we're making those connections. But like I said, I'm not going to reveal too much, but you're going to want to watch and listen to both documentaries, because they are going to make you feel inspired and hopeful. And, you know, I was at a Little League game yesterday in Uvalde the day before. And I was like, dude, I know why people would want to live in a place like Uvalde, man. You know, like, man, it's a good life. Tranquilidad, you know, except it's not that illusion, right? And so we have to confront that. And there's a next generation of activists born of this horror who are part of the change in your state and in the country, and frankly, I believe in the world. So there's a lot of amazing things coming up for Futuro Media, for Futuro Investigates. Get away from me! And
flies up on stage. Sorry about that.
And I do hope, you know, once we get over the serious stuff, I do want to do a sex show, so that's happening too.
The good news is we don't have to wait too much longer for the Uvalde.
No, it's going to be the days right before the 1-year anniversary, so that's May 24th. And so it will be on the Tuesday before that, so probably around the 15th or so. If you watch public television or if you follow me, you'll be seeing and I might even be bringing, somebody might be helping me to bring a screening of the film here to El Paso. That may happen if enough of you ask for it, if you get rid of the fly.
So that brings an end to our time together. Stephanie Acosta from the Community Foundation just messaged me that we have a reception that's going to take place over in the foundation room, which is just right around the corner from here. People are, even if you haven't made reservations, you can walk up. The tickets are $100 per person. It is to benefit the Texas Book Festival and El Paso Matters. So if you want to continue the conversation and support great literary efforts and support local media, feel free to join us at the foundation room at 6:30. So I just want to thank Maria for such a great conversation, really meaningful. And thanks to all of you for coming out tonight. And again, thanks to the Texas Book Festival and the El Paso Community Foundation for making this possible. Thank you all very much.
Love you, El Paso.